How's everybody doing? Let me get my stuff on here. Okay. So, it's Tuesday. And what we're going to do today, again, is this little weird bit where, and I've never done this before actually, but it shouldn't be too big a deal. So we're going to be talking a little bit. You can tell this is sort of material from the next part of the course. So every time I kind of switch PowerPoint backgrounds, right? So, and next after, in the last part of the course, what we're going to be talking about is mental illness. Kind of the ways that people differ from other people in these extreme ways, and what is it. What I really want to talk about today is sort of definitional issues. Just get us to think a little bit about what it means, what mental illness means. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of it, how you define it. A little bit about, some of the stuff, I don't remember if I'm actually going to talk about it or not. What causes mental disorders and how we classify them, some issues like that. So, again, the odd thing is that this stuff is not on the exam, right? So you have an exam on Thursday, everybody remembers, right? Same deal, you've seen this slide every time, 64 multiple choice questions, covering the material up to last Thursday. Make sure you get here or to the overflow room, and you'll get an email about that if that's if you're assigned there. And come early, bring your Scantron pencils, all that kind of stuff. Study guide posted on the webpage since last week. So, and we're going to have review sessions. So all your discussion sections this week will be reviewing stuff for the exam. So make sure you take advantage of those. Any questions about any of that? Again, man, nothing today is on that exam. So, we hear a lot about mental illness. It's on TV all the time. Some very popular television shows like Dexter and Monk. It's a famous movie, The Beautiful Mind, about schizophrenia. We know from all sorts of other situations too about people who seem to be struggling with mental illness. And the line between what's mentally ill and what's some other kind of thing, right? Just being eccentric or just being evil in some ways, right, is a question that we're faced with a lot. Again, these school shooters, are they the people who go out and shoot people, are they mentally ill, or are they just evil somehow? Should they be held responsible for what they do? What is it? What does it mean to be mentally ill? Somebody like Charlie Sheen, mentally ill. What about things like post-traumatic stress? What is that? Is that mental illness? Is that, how do we draw the lines and figure out what's normal, what's not normal, what's some range of normal sort of variation, and what's, to use a technical term, crazy? All right, so this is a question that we face all the time. And I want us to just kind of ponder it at sort of a higher level today and talk a little bit about the history of the idea, because it predates modern psychology by thousands and thousands of years. The idea that, for a long time, some people in the culture, in the society, in the group that you're in, act a little weird. Sometimes weird in very significant ways. And it's not like this idea was lost even on prehistoric people. So there is really good evidence from as far back as 6500 BC that people had some basic concept of mental illness in the sense of generally believing, casting it in the sense of some kind of evil spirits or demons that have taken over the person, and that they tried to deal with it in some way. So that it's really interesting across a variety of different places in the world. They found evidence, found these ancient skulls where there's been some kind of a surgical hole cut into. I don't know why this thing's going in and out. Come on, baby. It's like really simple. It's a microphone. Should be able to work. So this idea of finding these skulls with these holes cut in the head, right? So the idea was that they were, what seems to be the case is they were trying to let the evil demons out of the person's skull. And it seemed like a good idea. Person's acting weird in various ways. What do? Well, I bet they're possessed by some demon. There's some evil spirit in there. How do you get it out? Well, let's cut a hole in their head and see if that helps, right? And that seemed to be a common early treatment. And there's on ancient Mesopotamian tablets, there's some reference to what they called skull shaving, which seems to be the same sort of idea. And again, what it's usually sort of viewed in these moral terms, right? That this person probably did something wrong. They committed some kind of a sin. They were taken over by some evil spirit, and that's how you explained their behavior, right? So this conflation of mental illness with sin, with some sort of moral transgression and evil, right, was there at the beginning. As human society moved forward, there were slightly more sophisticated versions of what mental illness is. So the Greeks and Romans, as I alluded to last time, had this basic theory, the four humors, right, that there were these four liquids in the body that could be imbalanced in some ways, and that if somebody was acting odd, well, maybe it was it was too much of one of these fluids in the body, and then they would try to adjust one of the humors, right? So they would do things like bleeding people, or giving them laxatives to get rid of things, and just generally this idea of trying to use this notion of the four humors that was originally, again, developed by Hippocrates. So it was a sort of an integrated theory, right? So Hippocrates is generally held up as being sort of the first physician, the Hippocratic Oath that physicians even take today, right? So their idea is they had this model that helped to explain both sort of certain kinds of physical illnesses as well as certain kind of mental illnesses. So this integrated view of biology and psychology that was developed by the Greeks and then carried on by the Romans, right? Again, the treatments that they enacted were not particularly helpful, probably, but they had some theory. And again, one of the themes that we're going to run through again and again is that the treatment, and we're going to talk a lot in this section of the class about treating mental illness, right? And how people treat mental illness is directly a function of what they think is wrong. So if you think that the problem is these four humors out of balance, well, then you have to adjust those balance of those four humors. You see that again. Theory defines how it is that you approach it. So if your theory's wrong, right, you're not going to do much good for people. Right? But they had a fairly integrated idea about this, a thoughtful idea. As, again, we move forward, there was sort of during the Middle Ages in particular, there was a regression back toward this, I think, conflation of mental illness with sin and evil somehow. So, one of this general idea, again, is that if somebody was acting odd in some way, and we're going to talk about what that means by acting odd, right? Some way that's out of the ordinary or maybe potentially dangerous in some ways, either to themselves or others, right? So the idea was, they were possessed by some evil spirit, probably because of something that they did, but in any case, it was some evil that had taken over. And they had to do something to make the devil, the evil spirits leave the body. Again, they still did things like trifitting. They still would cut holes in the head occasionally, but they would also do things like, elaborate ceremonies to exorcise demons from people. Again, this viewing mental illness through this spiritual, moral, religious lens, right? They would think, gee, what we have to do is get the devil out of this person. And of course, we know, about things like the Salem witch trials and that era in which people thought that, again, if somebody was acting unusual, that perhaps they were a witch of some kind, some evil, again, some conflation of moral. This is driving me freaking crazy, this stupid microphone. It's such a... I don't know why it's not operating correctly. Does it bother you as much as it bothers me? It's just me. It's just me. Thanks, guys. Thanks for backing me up. I'm just demonstrating a little mental illness for you up here, isn't it? Right? It's just a class demonstration, nothing to worry about. Anyway, so this idea that, gee, if you're acting on, again, very often you can, and these are themes, right? So, what did it mean by acting on? You were acting out of the ordinary sometimes. Very often, in this era in particular, it was inflicted upon women, again, more than men. This idea that, you're acting, you're not conforming to the social roles that you're supposed to be in, you're acting funny, you must be a witch. Well, what do? Well, we gotta figure out whether you're a witch, and we gotta fix this, right? So we're gonna burn you at the stake, maybe. That would be helpful. Another great strategy was to take somebody to a body of water, tie a boulder to them, throw them into the water. And the idea was, if you drowned, then you must not have been a witch. But if you didn't drown, then how the heck could you get out of that situation, right? Again, so then you must be a witch, and then they burned you at the stake or something. So it was both a diagnosis, an unfortunate one. She must not have been a witch, right? She went to the bottom and drowned, or not. But again, this sort of really unusual, at least in our standards, this kind of moral view of mental illness, and then an ineffective kind of way to diagnose and treat it, right? As we move into the modern era, just kind of the sort of modern era in many ways is traced to a guy named, a physician named Benjamin Rush, who is very well known in the United States. In fact, he was one of the original signers of the Declaration of Independence. And he became a very prominent physician and really brought in the notion of somewhat more humane treatment for people. So for years, again, if you didn't get burned at the stake, and you were the people who were really seriously mentally ill, you would at best be put into some kind of a room, chained down, and left there. You're treated miserably, right? So Benjamin Rush advocated a more humane treatment for mentally ill people, institutions that they were put in, and they were tried to treat them. But again, and so he sort of ushered in this modern era of trying to deal with this humane way. It's not your fault. There's some sort of disease, in a sense, that you have, right, that we can help you with. Of course, he wasn't particularly helpful when he did do things. So Rush was a big advocate of some really kind of interesting things, like putting depressed people in a spinning chair and spinning them around as fast as they could, right, to try and cure their depression. Again, he did believe in bleeding and some things like that. He also had this funny thing where he would fake people's deaths, right? So he would either put them in a really constrained space like this and kind of make them feel like they were in a coffin, or basically try to scare people to death to treat their mental illness. So it wasn't like his view of mental illness was particularly modern, right? It wasn't. His treatments, again, were not particularly effective, and we view them as sort of barbaric, but at least his general approach sort of ushered in this modern era of trying to think about people as not as afflicted with some kind of a disorder rather than some moral transgression, which is a big advance. But still today, and we're going to talk more, the rest of the class, we're going to talk about these modern approaches, right? But it's still, the whole idea of what mental illness is a really challenging idea. We're still troubled by that a lot. So let me give you, a kind of a case study to think about a little bit. This is a very famous case. How many people know about the case of Elizabeth Smart, who was a young girl, I think she was 14 at the time, when she was abducted out of her, she was sleeping in her bedroom upstairs. These two people, Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee, were snuck into her room at night, abducted her, took her for about 9 months, Mitchell married her in his own ceremony, took her as a wife, repeatedly raped her daily, drugged her over the course of 9 months, and where they were just kind of living in various ways on the street in the wilderness. They were eventually caught when the Elizabeth Smart's younger daughter sort of remembered a clue about his name, or a name that he was referred to, and she was rescued. She actually turned out very nicely now after this horrible experience. She is now married and actually I think is an ABC correspondent. And it's interesting that what I want to talk about is the case that went on, because one of our former faculty member, a good friend of mine, Jen Scheme, was one of the people who was involved in trying to evaluate his mental health. So the question really became, when he was caught, is this guy mentally ill or not? Right? And so I want you to, this is the kind of decision we know gets made a lot in these trials, right? There's a big high-profile one right now with the American Sniper case with Chris Kyle and his killer, where they're trying to decide if he was shot with a friend by a distressed former Iraq War veteran, and the question is, well, gee, was he mentally ill at the time? Is he responsible or not? So this issue of sort of whether people are responsible or mentally ill comes up a lot. Let me just read you some information about the case here, about particularly about David Mitchell, or Brian Mitchell, excuse me, and get you to think about what you think about his mental case. So this is actually the actual sort of brief information about the case. So the presenting problem, again, it says that this individual came to the attention of the criminal justice system after being accused of abducting Miss X, Elizabeth Smart, a 14-year-old girl. He is currently being assessed for his competency to stand trial. At issue is whether he has a mental disorder or is merely eccentric, right? So here are his core beliefs. This individual believes that the world, including mainstream LDS Church, Latter-day Saints, so Mormon Church, he believes the mainstream LDS Church has become wicked and must repent. He is a true prophet of the last days who will restore the law of plural marriage and become the righteous right hand of God. The marriage of Miss X was a great sign of great sign and portent to the world of the last days. So he believes he is the Davidic king who will suffer in the similitude of Christ at the hands of the wicked in a contemporary redemptive sacrifice. This sacrifice will occur through martyrdom at trial. There will be a period of great destruction, famine, and war in which God punishes the wicked. This will help prepare the world to receive this individual as the modern Messiah. This individual will be delivered from the hands of the wicked in prison within 9 years to lead the righteous to Zion. There he will have a great battle with the Antichrist, a man financed by the World Bank who will have risen up to rule America. He will defeat the Antichrist and rule at the right side of God. He will be reunited with his wives. His barren wife's womb will be opened up to bring forth a son to sit upon the throne of his father David. Right, his socio-political beliefs. It says, first, this individual believes in alternative medicine. Traditional medicine is false, a sham that doctors and pharmaceutical companies have maintained for financial gain. Lymphology, a form of alternative medicine, can cure illnesses and slow death. Second, he believes in constitutionalism. The government has drifted astray of inspired forefathers to mandate atheism in public institutions. Social institutions, welfare oppress the poor and the afflicted. Third, he believes in conspiracies. The LDS church leaders are drunk with power through the UN and World Bank, conspiring to establish New World Order to bring all under the control of a single corrupt government. Finally, the background that they listed. So this is a middle-aged individual with no significant history of mental health treatment. He is bright, creative, and skilled by all accounts. He worked for a decade as a machinist, held a top position in the LDS church, and was a loving father and husband. Over the past 2 decades, he stopped paying child support, stopped paying taxes, stopped using his social security number, and rejected conventional medicine. He quit his job, sold all of his possessions, and was excommunicated from his church. Over the past decade, he has traveled with his wife across the country to minister. He has no home and no social ties, but has successfully depended upon the charity of others. So that's the background that they have in the case. And the question, after you listen to that, what I want you to do, get out your clickers. Well, I'm hitting the wrong buttons, aren't I? Having trouble. Okay, so here's the question. Is this person, do they have a mental disorder? Do they have mental illness or not? Yes or no? What do you think? A yes, B no. Four, three, two, one. Somebody in? Okay. So 68% of you think he's mentally ill, but 31% of you think that he's not. All right? Interesting. Who wants to, does anybody want to tell me why they think he's either mentally ill or not? Somebody who thinks he's not mentally ill. Go ahead. Tell us why you think that.
Because
it's real loud.
Because all of his actions seem to be aligned with whatever his beliefs were. There wasn't like anything erratic, or there wasn't any sort of erratic behavior. What he did pretty much matched up with what he thought was right to him.
So interesting. So you're saying it's because it's sort of, in a sense, internally consistent. So what he believed, he acted on, and it wasn't like it was sort of disorganized or crazy.
He knew exactly what he was doing.
He knew exactly what he was doing. Anybody want to take either the opposite view or say something else?
Although I do agree with that the things are consistent, it's the beliefs that constitute his mental illness. Like the paranoid schizophrenic, it's his beliefs or his beliefs that constitute that illness. So why might his beliefs, which are a little bit off, be the mental illness?
So you're saying that because his beliefs are off, they're inaccurate, or that's why he's mentally ill? And so what's the other part?
So, no, I mean that although his beliefs and his actions are consistent, that doesn't mean that he's not ill. Because the beliefs are ill, they're not, right?
Right, so it's interesting. So you're saying, well, they're internally consistent, so they kind of make sense that, sure, he believes things that other people don't believe, but he's sort of acting in some sort of pseudo-rational way based on his beliefs, which we all do. And you're saying, well, his beliefs are odd enough, unusual, inaccurate enough, or crazy enough that even though he's acting consistently, that means he's mentally ill. Go ahead.
But the thing is that because society has a set of beliefs that's what they consider right. So then all of a sudden you have this individual with beliefs that widely vary from what's considered the standard for society. So just because those beliefs are different, it might make some people consider that as mental illness, even though what it really is just something really, really freaking different.
So just because he's different doesn't mean he's mentally ill. Einstein had different beliefs than other people, right? So that's your argument. Go ahead.
Well, it seemed like there was a moment in time where he was no longer able to function with his beliefs. So initially he had a belief system and he was able to function in society, but there was a certain point where he lost everything and then kind of just went AWOL. So I feel like it's like he was able to function, but then at a certain point no longer could.
So you think he's mentally ill because he's not able to function. So in what sense isn't he able to function?
Well, he quit his job.
Mm-hmm.
He was no longer head of his church. He obviously had some sort of status that was no longer in play anymore.
So when some CEO of a company quits his job and goes to live on an island, does that mean he's crazy? So what else about him is crazy? Or in what sense is he not functioning well? Is he happy? Do you think he was happy when he was off wandering around with her?
I mean, I assume so.
We don't know, right? But
Yeah.
right. So is that important? So what makes him crazy then? If he is, or not?
That he thinks it's okay to kidnap this 14-year-old girl and drug her and keep her in his shack.
So say that aloud again for everybody.
You're saying that the CEO is crazy because he quits his job and goes to an island, but he doesn't go and kidnap this child. That's what he did, you know? Like, that's what makes him crazy. Like, no safe person would be like, oh, it's okay that I'm doing this. Like, there has to be something wrong.
So in some sense, it made perfect sense in his worldview to kidnap a girl, but he kidnapped a girl. He kidnapped a 14-year-old girl. So he harmed somebody, right? So you can see all the elements that you guys are picking up on, right? So it's harming other people, maybe being distressed and not functional, maybe not believing what's real or true. All those things kind of are knocking around here, right? But you can find other examples maybe where things like that, where people what if it's a lesser extent that somebody's just raising their kids, I don't know, without television or without books because of their religion. Is that crazy? So you might think that that's harming the person, right? Not like kidnapping, but so does that make somebody? Go ahead, one more.
So were we trying to determine if he was mentally ill to see if he was competent to stand trial? Is that why the question was?
Well, I'm going to ask you that in just a second. Well, let me ask it. So let's see. So here, there's sort of an extension, right, of the question, which is, should he be judged not guilty? Should he have been judged not guilty? If he's crazy, is he responsible or not responsible for what he did? So should he have been judged not guilty by reason of insanity and released as soon as he's cured? So yes or no? Tell me what you think about that. A yes, B no. Not whether he's crazy, but should he be judged not guilty by reason of insanity? Okay, so we got everybody in. Oh, somebody got in at the last minute? No. So 68, I think maybe percent of you said you thought he was mentally ill. But now 62% of you think that that's not a reason for him to not be responsible. What's up with that? So maybe you had a comment about this. Go ahead.
I did.
So you did or didn't?
No, I did.
Okay, speak up. Good.
Thank you. I just think that yes, he could possibly be mentally ill, and maybe he needed help way before he kidnapped a 14-year-old girl, but that doesn't change the fact that he kidnapped and raped a 15-year-old girl. And there are plenty of people that have paranoid schizophrenia who don't kidnap and rape 15-year-old girls, and there's nothing like within any medical diagnosis that says it is outside of his power to not kidnap and rape 15-year-old girls. And it's like, that's a conscious decision that he made, whether or not he was of sound mind when he made it, and he should be prosecuted.
So and I'm just trying to sort out the logic. So,
Like, there's no part of his mental illness that would have made it, like, impossible for him to avoid destroying this girl's life, basically, is what I'm saying.
right. So other people with similar kinds of mental situations don't do this. There's nothing so he's responsible, even though maybe he's really delusional, listening to hearing voices, things like that. Does that take away the responsibility in your mind?
I think it might say that he needs treatment if he wasn't in control of his actions at the time, but I don't think that that means that he should not bear the responsibility for his actions.
Uh-huh.
So maybe he wasn't in control of his actions, but that doesn't mean that he's
So what did you say for the first question? Did you say yes, he was mentally ill?
Yes.
So yes, so you're right in this pattern, right? So there's a lot of people probably are, right? So yes, he's mentally ill, but no, he's not responsible. Yet another comment over here? Go ahead.
Yeah,
Real loud.
okay, if he was at a point in his mind where he thought it was going to make him truly happy to kidnap and rape 15-year-old girls, he was clearly mentally unstable, and if all that was a massive excess of dopamine that was just a chemical imbalance, then he's really not to blame. It's just essentially, if he was in a schizophrenic break, he was essentially hallucinating for months at a time. It's kind of hard to blame someone for their own actions when they are in a mental set where they firmly believe that harming other people is going to make them happy, and it's just a illness.
So these are kind of the two juxtaposing positions. So essentially what he said, in case you can hear, is, well, he's suffering this, in the short version, he's suffering this kind of mental or this chemical imbalance, maybe some neurotransmitter in the brain. He shouldn't be held responsible for those crazy things that he did, because it's really that the chemical sort of situation in his brain is what's causing him to do these things, right? So he excuses responsibility. So in some sense, that makes sense to people, right? That mental illness, if you're really sort of not together, then you're not really responsible for the things that you do. We've all done, similar things like this. Maybe you get drunk and you do something, you go, really, you can't blame me for that. I wasn't under control of my own senses, there's a little chemical imbalance going on, and we get that, right, at one level. We also get this other position, right, that somehow he, even however odd his beliefs might be, he somehow made a choice to act in a way that's responsible, or that hurts somebody else, that he should be held responsible, right? So this is all these kind of issues are what make mental illness so hard to think about. What is it? What's the boundary between really being mentally ill and not being mentally ill, and what does it have to do with the responsibility? One last comment. Go ahead.
I think that mental illness is an explanation, not a justification.
It's an explanation, not a justification. Go ahead, keep going.
Right, so even though what he says is true, it's still not a reason to get off. Just get off. This person still needs to at least undergo treatment, and if it's so severe, I don't see how a person can just, with the short treatment that the type that the government offers, could just turn this guy's life around and make him never do something like this again, because it's so severe.
Okay, so even though it's severe and everything, he doesn't absolve him of responsibility. So your roommate comes to you one day, 2 o'clock, looks at you and says, "I don't like you," and throws up on you. Do you hold him responsible?
Yeah,
So that person's got this stomach flu and throws up on you. Do you hold him responsible? Which roommate are you more angry at? The one who threw up you because he had the stomach flu, or threw up you on purpose? Right? So right. This is what makes it so hard to think about. It's like, at some level, yeah, when some illness causes you to do something, then you shouldn't be held responsible for it. But in this case, we don't quite get that with mental illness, right? It's not quite the same. It doesn't feel like that stomach flu example, right? And that's what's so interesting about all of it. And we're still wrestling with that, and the field still wrestles with all these kinds of issues, right, of what is mental illness. And we're going to talk about some of this stuff today. Let's talk about kind of the modern view of it for a second. So how do we define, how does modern psychology and psychiatry try to define mental illness, right? And then, again, the interesting thing you'll see is that it changes over time. It evolves based on what's going on in the society and everything else. But there's a few dimensions that seem to be really sort of critical at both a common sense, both a common sense way and in a technical, scientific way. So, for example, the behavior has to be extreme somehow, right? It's atypical. Right? So if you're just a little sad one day, that's not depression. But if you're lost in hopelessness, and you're not getting out of bed, you're not going to school, doing those things, right? If it's really, really extreme, then that is. So something about it has to be extreme. Are his beliefs a little odd? Well, many of his socio-political beliefs that we talked about are really probably kind of in the mainstream. People that, nobody's paying attention to the Constitution, things like that. Well, yeah, is that? Well, what about his other beliefs about thinking he's, the Messiah and all that? Well, that seems more extreme, right? So somehow the beliefs and the behaviors have to be extreme and atypical, right? And there's an interesting word, atypical, right? Unusual. We'll kind of explore that. Have to be socially undesirable in some ways. And again, you can see what a problematic concept that can potentially be. So does it fall outside the norms of culture, subculture? Is it socially different? Is he doing things? So we don't think that you should be taking 14-year-old girls out of their rooms, right? But we might not think other things are, raising your kids in some, relatively, different way, a way that I would think, isn't good for kids. Well, not everybody thinks that. It's kind of in a realm. How is it? It's got to be socially deviant, unacceptable somehow. Distress. So we tapped into this. Is this person distressed? Does somehow their condition seem to be not working for them and or not working for other people, disturbing other people, threatening other people, potentially dangerous to other people, right? So if you're harmless, if you have some delusional belief that you're a unicorn or something and you're walking around throwing flowers at people and you're seeming perfectly happy, well, that seems a little, but I don't know, it doesn't seem as bad, right? So there's something about distress and threat to self and others, and this idea of disability, and which I think you alluded to here as well. Is this working for the person, right? Are they able to hold down a job? Are they able to, have a life and keep out of trouble in various ways? Or is it maladaptive? Now, again, each of these singularly might be a problem. So you could be a mass murderer and be as happy as a clam, right? And not be disabled. But if you're fulfilling all these, so all of these have these are the basic criterion that underlie a lot of the thinking, right? It's unusual, it's not good unusual, it's potentially damaging to you or somebody else, and it's not working for you. You're not able to sort of function in society, right? So there's a lot of societal stuff going on here that you're doing things that society doesn't approve of, that aren't working. And then there's some other elements that seem more kind of, you can get a grip on, like it's not working for you, or you might hurt somebody else, or you have hurt somebody else, right? So all of these kind of ideas are in our intuition, and they underlie a lot of the work. Right? So the trick is, how do you turn things like that into an objective way to think about and define mental illness? And that's what the field has been working on for decades now, and it manifests itself in this book, the kind of Bible of mental illness, which is called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM. And again, it keeps evolving. We are now as of May 2013, we're on the DSM-V, so the 5th version of this. Now, it's published by the American Psychiatric Association, but again, sort of there was this bias at first to treat mental illness as sort of as a physical disorder, so psychiatrists, medical doctors, psychiatrists are medical doctors as opposed to psychologists, right, have been sort of largely in charge, but now this is deeply involved, psychologists are deeply involved in this as well. But again, what you see is that there's been a whole bunch, there was a DSM-1, 2, 3, they keep revising it, a DSM-3R, a DSM-3R, a DSM-4R, TR, all these, so it keeps developing. But basically what they are is they're these set of criteria where you try to say, well, how do I diagnose whether you have a mental illness, and what mental illness is it, and is it severe enough to be defined as a mental illness? So they really become these kind of lists. It's this kind of list way of doing things. This is actually out of the DSM-IV, but it hasn't changed much. So this is the definition of mental disorder. It's a clinically significant behavioral or psychological syndrome or pattern that occurs in an individual and that is associated with present. And again, these are the basic sorts of things that we talk about. Distress, right? So it's causing the person distress. It's causing disability, impairment of one or more important areas of functioning. And with a significantly increased risk of suffering, death, pain, disability, or an important loss of freedom. Right? So those are kind of the crucial elements. I'm trying to see if there's, right? And it must not be merely an expectable and culturally sanctioned response to a particular event. So, again, you can imagine, not to be too, topical and close to the bone, but if your child gets murdered by a terrorist or something and you're depressed for several months, people go, is that mental illness? No, that seems like a culturally expected response to a terrible thing. So terrible things happen to people, and people sometimes respond in ways, but again, it can't just be sort of a normal response. So it's all rattling around here, right? It's this idea, it can't be normal, right? It can't be in the normal range. It's got to be causing distress, disability, again, risk of suffering, death, pain, loss of freedom, like you can't maintain yourself, all these sorts of things. So that's sort of the general definition, right? And you can see how it kind of fits those commonsensical categories. And then what the DSM does is lays out all these rules for trying to sort these things out. So for any disorder, it's got, and we're going to go over these, it categorizes mental disorders into a whole bunch of different categories. These are mood disorders. So these are all from the DSM-IV, actually. But all, what does that sound? Is that me? What was I doing to make that sound? So what you do is you go through, and it's got a list of disorders. Associated with each disorder is a series of symptoms and things like that. So you go. So here is the criteria for a major depressive episode. This is only part of it. So it tries to give psychologists, psychiatrists objective criteria by which to define things. So you have to have 5 or more of the following symptoms have been present during the same 2-week period, at least one of which is number 1 or number 2. So to be labeled as depressed, and we'll talk about what all these categories mean in more detail later. But you have the depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day. It can be irritable mood in children. Marked diminished interest in or pleasure in all or almost all activities. So you have to have those plus, 5 or more of the following symptoms: feelings of worklessness, fatigue or loss of energy, all these different things, right? So they go, oh yeah, you've got this, and you try to diagnose whether people have those, and if they fit those categories, they get defined with a particular mental illness, right? So you can see so in the modern view, there's no moral connotation, really, although you see those moral things are really rattling around about responsibility and things like that. But they're trying to say, objectively, here's what is a mental disorder, and here's what kind it is, and this is how you figure it out by looking at these different criteria, right? And for every one of these disorders, there's just this kind of strategy that people can go through. So how does it develop this idea? That seems, oh wow, that sounds great, right? That sounds really good. That sounds like really scientific. That's the way we should be doing it, trying to make it so it isn't just, some religious belief or some other sort of social judgment. But the idea is, how do we develop these criteria? Well, part of it's science, right? So there's lots of research being done, and some of which we'll talk about in here. Part of it's committee consensus. So there's a group of people who have to sort of decide, what this is, right? So they have to. So there is this component where there's a bunch of people getting around and saying, "Yeah, I think that's a mental disorder. No, I don't think it is." How important all of it is, right? So the idea is that you don't want to reify these categories too much, right? So they're trying to. What reify means to make real, right? So they're trying to make these things really, really real and saying, yeah, here, this is what a disease is. You can see that you don't have the, very often you're working with behavioral things. This microphone's driving me nuts. Guess it's appropriate. Right? So you get what they want you to believe, right, or what the whole flavor of it is this is real, this is absolutely real. These are real things, right? Not some construction of them, but think about some examples. So until 1980, homosexuality was a mental disorder in the DSM. Now it's not. Now, gay marriage is legal in 37 states of the country, right? So what's going on there? Is it a mental disorder or is it not? It used to be, now it's not. Why? Did it get different somehow? Or did society change the way they think about it? Right? Another example, post-traumatic stress disorder was not originally in the DSM and really became part of the DSM, I think the DSM-III originally, and really because of a political movement among Vietnam veterans many of whom came back. They used to think of this, after World War I, World War II, you were shell-shocked, you were kind of a weak person who, you went to Army and you lost it and you had a little bit of sympathy, but and there isn't really a mental disorder. What happened is the Vietnam veterans after the Vietnam War came in and made a political movement to try to make this be seen as a mental and get categorized as a mental illness, right? And that worked. So can you do that with physical disorders? Can you have a political movement to make a physical disorder become now a disease when it wasn't before? Right, so there's this kind of funny socially constructed aspect of a lot of these things, right? And it changes based on societal criteria. And you see the criteria, how those sort of, right, it's whether it's socially acceptable, right? And whether it causes distress. Well, something like homosexuality, being gay 50 years ago probably caused a certain amount of distress, right? People were not doing well because people didn't approve of it. Didn't see it as part of normal. They saw it as extreme, not within the normal range of sexual behavior, right? It probably caused people a lot of grief, right? So it surely did, right? Well, does that make it sort of fit those criteria at the time, but it doesn't anymore. So there is this sort of social component to this that's really interesting. And again, psychologists try really hard to work against this, but it's just sort of naturally part of the problem. The way we think about mental illness is a little bit different from physical illness. Well, some other things, PMS, is that a psychiatric disorder? Well, it is now, right? So it's become a premenstrual dysphoric disorder, right? You could say, well, it's a natural response to a natural process. Who wants to call it a disorder? Who doesn't? Well, if you call it a disorder, then lots of good things happen, right? You maybe get medications, and they become prescriptions. So there's value, in a sense, in defining certain things as a mental disorder versus not a mental disorder. There's money in it, right? So this is one of the issues that people come in all the time. Hyperactivity, ADHD, and other kinds of bad behavior, right? Well, gee, is it a kid just acting bad? A kid who can't sit still in class, maybe, or a kid who's out, has some, is acting like a delinquent somehow. Well, is that a mental disorder, or is that just a bad kid? Right? Immoral or judgment, right? Well, again, defining these things, you can make a lot of money. And there's been, one of the things we know, again, the way these diagnoses change. So this is the percentage of children aged 3 to 17 who've been diagnosed with attention hyperactivity disorder. It's gone up pretty dramatically, particularly for boys over, the years, right? So we've made and it becomes something that, it labels a disorder, it explains it. Does it justify it? I don't know. But then if you can treat it, then there's money involved and all sorts of things happen. And this is, you see this general trend. So, this is, if you look across the DSM, the first DSM, that's actually the DSM-II, is this tiny little thing, right? It just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is an analysis, again, in the DSM-1, there were a little over 100 different labels for psychiatric conditions. Now there's over 800. The first one was about 51 pages, and this one's 900 pages. So there's this sort of sense of, let's just keep expanding. More and more things become mental illness, right? Is that good or bad? Well, I don't know. There's certainly been lots of good stuff there, things that we didn't recognize that were mental disorders causing people a lot of trouble, right, that we now recognize are. But at another level, you get this sense of, gee, it seems like maybe this is out of control. Maybe, how are we deciding these things? Maybe it's these political forces. Maybe it's these social changes that are doing it, right? And that kind of wrestling with that whole notion is, is something I want you guys to think about as you're, listening to sort of the descriptions of all the different disorders we're going to be talking about and this kind of proliferation problem. So get out your clickers and tell me this. So after I've talked about this, do you think mental illness is like a physical illness? Is it more of a social construction? So A, mental illness is real. B, mental illness is a social construction. Or C, mental illness is real but different from physical illness. Which do you think it is? A, B, or C? It's mental illness is real. No, it's really just a social construction. Or it's real, but it's not like a physical disorder. C. Yeah, let's see. Okay. So I knew everybody picked C, right? But so what do we got? We got 33% of the people saying that it is real. Small set of people, 11% say it's a social construction. And most people think, I guess it's only 55%, think that it's something in between. And this is kind of in lay terms, that's the debate, right? Where you see that at some modern medicine, modern helping professions, medicine, psychiatry, psychology, want to make it like a physical illness. They want you to think about it like a physical illness, right? There's this other extreme that, no, it's this complete social construction. You can kind of see where that comes from, right? And then this idea that most people tend to settle sort of in the middle, right? So let me give you, I've given you kind of what the DSM-IV is, kind of the extreme, kind of trying to objectify it. But there are a whole lot of people, there's a whole movement of people who want to think about it like a social construction, right? And it's kind of an interesting argument, and it's been made by many people. The most famous of which is a guy named Thomas Szasz, who wrote a really well-known book called The Myth of Mental Illness. And his basic position, again, what he argues, is that mental disorders aren't really diseases at all, right? In any real sense, that psychiatry is just, and psychology is just a form of social control, right? That we've created this idea of mental illness to label people, stigmatize them, so that we can control their behavior. You're not acting the way we want you to act. So you're got this mental illness, and I'm going to give you some drugs to control you. And he's saying all of it's a myth. It's just like that prehistoric view. It's just like the Dark Ages, where you're acting up. You're a woman, maybe a young woman who's acting in ways that you're not conforming to the roles that you should be, these kind of repressed roles. And so therefore, we're going to teach you a lesson by burning you at the stake, right? He's saying that's really just the same thing that's going on now. And it argues against all kinds of the ideas of, particularly about any kind of use of drugs in mental illness. Now, it's become a very famous argument. Well, here's one of his quotes: "If you talk to God, you're praying. If God talks to you, you have schizophrenia." And he's kind of arguing, so what's the difference, right, between those two? There's two sort of well-known proponents of this view: Thomas Szasz and the other expert, really highly acclaimed mental health expert, Tom Cruise. And so let me play you a little bit of video of both of them. This is actually a very famous, I don't know if this is too old for people to remember this or have heard of it, when Tom Cruise went on the Today Show after he was criticizing Brooke Shields, who's a very famous actress, right? She had been making the rounds talking about her postpartum depression after she was depressed after having her babies, and how therapy and how drugs in particular helped her. And he found this very offensive, and again, made his Thomas Szasz-like argument. And I'll let you listen to this because it's kind of fun just to listen to him.
And then when I started studying psychiatry, I started realizing more and more why I didn't agree with psychiatry. And as far as the Brooke Shields thing is, look.
This goes for a little while. I'll just let it go because it's kind of fun.
I think here's a wonderful and talented woman. And I want to see her do well. And I know that psychiatry is a pseudoscience.
But Thomas, she said that this particular thing helped her feel better, whether it was the antidepressant or going to a counselor or a psychiatrist. Isn't that enough?
Matt, you have to understand this. Here we are today, where I talk out against drugs and psychiatric abuses of electric shocking people, okay, against their will, of drugging children with them not knowing the effects of these drugs. Do you know what Adderall is? Do you know Ritalin? Do you know now that Ritalin is a street drug? Do you understand that?
The difference is,
Matt, I'm asking you a question.
I understand your abuse of all of these things.
No, you see, here's the problem. You don't know the history of psychiatry. I do.
Aren't there examples, and might not Brooke Shields be an example of someone who benefited from one of those drugs?
All it does is mask the problem, Matt. And if you understand the history of it, it masks the problem. That's what it does. That's all it does. You're not getting to the reason why. There is no such thing as a chemical imbalance.
So part of depression to you is
Matt,
kind of a little psychological gobbledygook?
No, I did not say that.
I'm just asking, what would you call it?
Matt, now you're talking about two different things.
But that's what she went on the antidepressant for.
But what happens to the antidepressant, all it does is mask the problem. There's ways in vitamins and through exercise and various things. I'm not saying that isn't real. That's not what I'm saying. That's an alteration of what I'm saying. I'm saying that drugs aren't the answer. That these drugs are very dangerous. They're mind-altering, antipsychotic drugs. And there are ways of doing it without that so that we don't end up in a brave new world. The thing that I'm saying about Brooke is that there's misinformation, okay? And she doesn't understand the history of psychiatry. She doesn't understand in the same way that you don't understand it, man.
But a little bit what you're saying, Tom, is you say you want people to do well, but you want them to do well by taking the road that you approve of, as opposed to a road that may work for them.
No.
Well, if antidepressants work for Brooke Shields, why isn't that okay?
I disagree with you. And I think that there's a higher and better quality of life. And I think that promoting, for me personally, so you're saying, what, I can't discuss what I want to discuss?
No, you absolutely
I know,
can.
but Matt, you're going in and saying that I can't discuss it.
I'm only asking, isn't there a possibility that, do you examine the possibility that these things do work for some people? That yes, there are abuses, and yes, maybe they've gone too far in certain areas. Maybe there are too many kids on Ritalin. Maybe electric shock.
The kids on Ritalin.
I'm just saying, but aren't there examples where it works?
You're good. You don't know what Ritalin is. If you start talking about chemical imbalance, you have to evaluate and read the research papers on how they came up with these theories, Matt. Okay? That's what I've done. And you go and you say, where's the medical test? Where's the blood test that says how much Ritalin you're supposed to get?
It's very impressive to listen to you because clearly you've done the homework and you know the subject.
And you should. And you should do that also. Because just knowing people who are on Ritalin isn't enough. You should be a little bit more responsible in knowing.
I'm really prescribing Ritalin.
So there's Tom Cruise lecturing Matt Lauer because he knows the psychiatric history of psychiatry and he doesn't. But expressing this sort of view of mental illness. So let me give you a slightly more interesting. This is Thomas Szasz talking about the same sort of thing and giving his sort of brief version of his ideas. Whoops.
When school authorities tell a mother that her son is sick and needs to be on drugs, how in the world is she to know that that is simply a lie. How is she to recognize that what experts now call attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is simply not a disease? Now, such a mother is not an expert in the history of psychiatry. She does not know that psychiatrists have, for hundreds of years, used diagnostic terms, so-called diagnostic terms, to stigmatize and control people. I will only give you a few dramatic examples. When black slaves in the South ran away to freedom, it wasn't that they wanted to be free. They suffered from a disease called drapetomania. From diabetes, runaway slave anemia. I'm not making this up. This was a legitimate diagnosis, just like attention deficit disorder is. Women, half population of mankind, of course, if they were foolish enough to rebel against domination by men, but then they had a serious disease called hysteria, which was due to their wandering womb. Now, none of those behaviors was ever a disease, and of course it's not a disease. But nor is attention deficit disorder a disease. No behavior or misbehavior is a disease or can be a disease. That's not what diseases are. So it doesn't matter how a child behaves. There is nothing to examine. If he is sick, then there must be some objective science to it, which can be diagnosed by physicians and objective tests. So, as soon as you go to a doctor, they take a lot of blood, and take x-rays. They don't want to hear how you behave. When I went to medical school, 60 years ago, there were only a handful of mental diseases. I think there were no more than 6 or 7. Now there are more than 300. And new ones are, quote, discovered every day. Labeling a child as mentally ill is stigmatization, not diagnosis. Giving a child a psychiatric drug is poisoning, not treatment. Diseases are malfunctions of the human body, of the heart, the liver, the kidney, the brain, and so forth. Typhoid fever is a disease. You all know that, you don't question that. Spring fever Spring fever is not a disease. The task we set ourselves to combat psychiatric coercion is important. I think it's important. You all think it's important. Not enough people think it's important. It's a noble task, a task in the pursuit of which we must, regardless of obstacles, persevere. Our conscience commands that we do no less.
So, I wanted to present you with that because I mean, it's sort of the extreme view on one side, but you can see that there's a certain amount of power to the idea, right? I mean, that when he talks about, well, you know, that people would define a slave running away as drapetomania, not as just somebody wanting to get out of slavery, right? It's a way of form of social control, and you can see the social components that get involved in things. But at some level, right, it also seems too extreme. He's really saying, well, it's got to be just like physical illness, and there's nothing like it. There's no chemical imbalances. There's no, right? And we know, and we don't feel like mental illness has always got a physical component, but many do, and we're going to talk about the sort of biological version of that, but it's this struggle between that's still going on about how do you think about mental illness, right? How do you make sense of it? Is it like physical illness? Is it, or is it something else, right? And let me tell you a little, and the reason I bring up things like these, where you see the conflict in people's minds sort of intuitively is in those examples where you say, oh yeah, this person who tried to kidnap Elizabeth Smart, oh yeah, he's mentally ill, but he's still responsible, right? Then that shows really nicely that somehow you're still responsible even though you got it, so it's not quite like other things, and so how do you think about it? And this is the struggle that sort of the modern psychological world has been struggling with, trying to make it as objective as possible, trying to define criteria very clearly, right? But also trying to capture the fact that it isn't just all physical disease. So again, the sort of contemporary version, to contrast it with the older views tended to see mental illness as, again, a moral problem. Some were sort of purely psychological problems. Freud and Rogers, for example, saw them as, didn't talk about biological causes at all, right? It was purely psychological. So you have moral versions, you have psychological versions. Now, then you kind of get this medical model, right? This push, right? As people kind of got over those things, they were saying, yeah, let's see, maybe mental disease is just like other diseases. It's completely biological, right? And we know that to a certain extent, and you're going to hear more about it, that's true, that there are genetic, and biological predispositions. But we also know that it isn't just that there's something powerful about the psychological view as well. And so what you get is this kind of the contemporary view, and I just want to sort of lay it out in this first session, and we'll fill all of this in as we go, right? It's this kind of biopsychosocial model, that all those things are important. I mean, not the moral version, but there's biological, there's genes and chemistry involved. There's psychological things. People really experience stressful things, and they learn bad ways to behave in various ways from their families and from their upbringing. And there's also this sort of sociocultural element to it about what you're expected to do, and you have to be sort of sensitive to the fact that how these things exist in sort of a social cultural world that that it could be a form of where things could be a form of social control. And the way that this is, that all these factors are involved, that you may have a biological predisposition, you experience some trauma, and you act in ways that are sort of not fitting this cultural model, and that's the way to understand mental illness. The other really sort of powerful concept that we're going to talk about is this idea of what's called the Diathesis-Stress model, right? It's, again, this is basically biopsychosocial model that people, and the idea of a diathesis-stress model is that you really need two things to get a mental disorder. You have to have what's called a diathesis, which is some sort of vulnerability or predisposition. So very often a biological predisposition for something. But that in and of itself doesn't tell you whether you're necessarily going to get mental illness or not, right? It may be you have that diathesis, and then if you then also experience some traumatic real-world event, some real psychological stressor or things, that's when that's going to manifest as mental illness. If you have just a diathesis and your life goes through without some other event that precipitates it, then things might go just fine. Or if you experienced some kind of trauma or stressor, but you don't have the vulnerability, then you may not get mental illness either. But if you have both the diathesis, both the vulnerability and experience the event, then that's what tends to produce mental illness. It's this kind of interactional idea as well, that you have a vulnerability and then stress brings it in. Let me just give you one sort of overarching example really quickly of something I think catches this really well. So this is a study, but we're going to talk more about schizophrenia and all these things later. But just give you an example from this. This is a really wonderful paper in 2004. It looked at the Finnish adoption study. So the participants were, again, there were 303 of them, and there were two different kinds. There were people who had a biological mother who was basically schizophrenic, who was somewhere on the schizophrenic spectrum, and the controls had biological mothers that didn't have that, right? And then they were adopted. So this is again part of one of these big adoption studies. And so they weren't raised by those biological parents. They were adopted into a family, and those families were characterized by the researchers as either disturbed families or healthy families. So either those families really weren't functioning well as families, or they were healthy families. And then they wanted to see what's the probability that these children end up with diagnosable mental illness, sort of schizophrenic illness at the end. And the data looks something like this. Again, this is the likelihood that the child will be diagnosed as schizophrenic. What you see is, this is the total. This is all the kids together, right? So if you've got a biolog, in the red bar, if you've got a mother who is on the schizophrenic spectrum, the child was much more likely to end up being diagnosed with schizophrenia than the child who didn't have a mother who had schizophrenia, right? So there's no question having a mother who's on the schizophrenic spectrum led people to be schizophrenic. But what happens when you break them out by what happened in their families, right? So this is the same, these two bars over here are this bar here broken out by family. So if you had a healthy family, if you were your biological mother was schizophrenic, but you were adopted into a healthy family, you didn't show any greater propensity to be schizophrenic than in the control, than if your parent wasn't schizophrenic. Something about that family muted those symptoms, resolved those symptoms. If you were, however, if you were both schizophrenic, had a predisposition, right, and were adopted into a disturbed family, you showed a very high probability of getting schizophrenia. And interestingly, even though you were in a disturbed family, the disturbed family didn't make you schizophrenic. So if you didn't have the predisposition, you weren't schizophrenic. But if you had both the predisposition and the bad family, both the diathesis and the stress, then that's when you get mental illness. So this is the sort of complicated biopsychosocial model, this diathesis-stress idea, you'll see is a really good explanation for lots and lots of different psychological disorders, right? That it seems to be the case that you've got some that when you get mental illness, it's a combined sort of affair, the person and the situation. Something about you, whether you've got that vulnerability or not, something about the situation, whether you're stressful or not. Now again, sometimes the diathesis can also not be biological, but it's simplest to think about that. So think about that idea in this sort of complicated version of mental illness that we're going to end up talking about starting next Tuesday, right? And what modern research tells us about how to figure out what kind of mental illness people have, if they have a mental illness, what are the varieties of mental illness, then ultimately we'll talk about how to treat them. Good luck on the exam. Go to your review sessions. Get here early on Thursday. Go get them, and I will see you next Tuesday.